For more than a century, the Basques were treated like Europe's great exception. Not just unusual, not just regional, an exception. They live in the Western Pyrenees, across northern Spain and southwestern France. They speak Euskera, or Basque, a language unlike Spanish, unlike French, unlike Latin, and unlike any other living language known today. Linguists classify it as a language isolate, the only surviving remnant of the languages once spoken in that part of southwestern Europe before Romanization swept across the region. And that fact alone is enough to pull you into the mystery. Because once you notice it, the obvious question is hard to avoid. How does a language like that survive in Europe? A continent layered with conquests, empires, migrations, religion, trade, and constant contact should have erased something this isolated a long time ago. But Euskera did not disappear. It held on. And that survival made the Basques seem different in a deeper way, too. Over time, researchers began pointing to biological traits that also looked unusual. One of the most famous involved the Aries blood group system. In modern genetic studies, Basque samples show a very high frequency of the Rhd deletion allele, measured at about 47.2% in one study. But this is exactly where the legend often outran the data. That number refers to a genetic deletion associated with RSD negative status, not a simple claim that 47% of Basques are RS negative in the casual, popular sense you often hear repeated. Even the researchers note that older studies made the pattern sound more extreme than newer molecular methods support. That detail matters, because this is not just a story about what science discovered. It is also a story about how a powerful myth forms. And once the Basques had both ingredients, a language with no known relatives and biological markers that looked unusual, the old theory almost wrote itself. Maybe, people thought, the Basques were not simply another European population. Maybe they were a remnant, a survival, a human holdover from the deep past. By the early and mid-20th century, that idea had become one of the most famous stories in European anthropology, that the Basques were a kind of living Paleolithic relic, a population left behind from the Ice Age while the rest of Europe changed around them. Now, to be fair, that theory did not survive for so long because everyone before modern DNA was foolish. It survived because, from the outside, it felt elegant. A language isolate suggests deep roots. An unusual blood group profile suggests separation. Mountain geography suggests protection. And when those clues all point in the same direction, the conclusion can feel inevitable. That is what made the Basque story so compelling. It seemed to offer something rare in European history, a direct line into prehistory, still breathing, still speaking, still visible. But here is the first crack in that story. The mystery was real. The interpretation was not necessarily real. That is a difference people often miss. Because the Basques are unusual, and the Basques are untouched Ice Age survivors are not the same claim. One is an observation. The other is an explanation. And in science, explanations do not survive just because they sound beautiful. They survive only as long as the evidence can carry them. For a long time, the evidence was indirect. Language, blood groups, geography, historical isolation, all important, all suggestive, but still indirect. Then the field changed. Ancient DNA gave researchers something earlier generations never had. A way to test old origin stories, not through clues on the surface, but through genomes pulled from actual ancient remains. And once that happened, the Basque myth was no longer protected by mystery. It had to face the timeline of real population change in Iberia. And that is where the famous story starts to come apart, because the first thing the new genetics would show is not that the Basques stood outside Europe's great prehistoric upheavals. It is that they did not. The old Basque theory did not collapse because one detail went wrong. It collapsed because a whole new kind of evidence arrived. For most of the 20th century, researchers were trying to reconstruct deep population history from indirect signs, language, blood groups, physical anthropology, geography. Those clues were not useless, but they could only point. They could not prove. Ancient DNA changed that by letting scientists compare present-day populations with genomes recovered from actual prehistoric individuals across Iberia. And once those genomes came into focus, one thing became impossible to ignore. Iberia had not been static, not even close. The ancient DNA record showed that the peninsula had already seen multiple layers of change over thousands of years. Hunter-gatherers, early farmers, later contacts from North Africa. The genetic landscape was shifting long before anyone started telling romantic stories about untouched survivors in the mountains. So, the first big correction is simple. The Basques did not exist outside history, waiting in a sealed prehistoric pocket while everyone else changed around them. The whole region was dynamic. Then came the real shock. Around 2000 BCE, during the Bronze Age, people carrying steppe-related ancestry spread into Iberia, and this was not a minor contact event. In the large 2019 Iberian ancient DNA study, researchers reported roughly 40% ancestry replacement across Iberia and a near 100% replacement of Y chromosome lineages by men with steppe ancestry. That is the kind of result that does not tweak an old theory. It destroys it. That point is worth slowing down for. Because the old Basque myth depended on the idea that they were a direct, unusually pure survival from the Paleolithic, somehow insulated from the major transformations that reshaped later Europe. But the steppe signal reached Iberia on a massive scale, and the male line turnover was especially dramatic. The broad pattern seen across the peninsula means the ancestors of later Basque populations were part of this transformed world too. And that is where the famous story flips. The Basques were not Europe's untouched exception to the Bronze Age. They were inside the Bronze Age story. In fact, one of the most striking conclusions from the Iberian ancient DNA work is that by the Iron Age, steppe ancestry had spread not only into Indo-European-speaking regions but also into non-Indo-European-speaking regions. That matters enormously here, because it means language and ancestry were no longer moving in perfect lockstep. A population could experience major genetic change and still not end up speaking an Indo-European language. That is the moment where an older, simpler version of history stops working, because for decades, many people assumed the logic ran like this. Unusual language equals very ancient population. Very ancient population equals minimal outside mixture. Minimal outside mixture equals Ice Age survival. Ancient DNA broke that chain in the middle. Yes, Basque is extraordinary. Yes, Basque populations became genetically distinctive. But no, that does not mean they passed from the Ice Age into the present untouched. The genomic evidence points instead to something much more complicated and frankly more interesting. You can see the shift most clearly in the male lineages. Modern Basque men overwhelmingly carry Y chromosome lineages within R1b, which are strongly associated with the Bronze Age expansions that spread steppe ancestry across Western Europe. That does not mean every individual's story was the same, or that culture vanished and restarted from zero. But it does mean the older image of the Basques as a living fossil population, genetically preserved from the Paleolithic in anything like a simple sense, cannot survive contact with the data. At this point, a viewer might think the mystery is over. Maybe the answer is just that the Basques were never especially unusual at all. Maybe they were simply another Iberian population transformed by the same Bronze Age forces as everyone else, and the old myth was nothing more than bad anthropology plus good marketing. But that would be too simple, too. Because the DNA did not merely destroy the old story, it created a harder one. If the ancestors of today's Basques were hit by the same broad prehistoric upheaval that changed the rest of Iberia, then why do Basques still stand out genetically today? And even more strangely, how did they keep a non-Indo-European language while so much of prehistoric Western Europe lost theirs? That is the real mystery ancient DNA leaves us with, not whether the Basques were unchanged, but when exactly they became distinct, and what kept that distinctiveness alive after the old myth had already failed. So after the old story breaks, a new question takes its place. If the Basques were not a frozen Ice Age relic, then what exactly are we looking at? This is where the mythbreaker lens becomes useful, because it stops us from jumping from one oversimplified story straight into another. The DNA does not say the Basques were ordinary in every sense. It says their distinctiveness has to be explained differently, and that difference is everything. Ancient DNA work on Iberia found that present-day Basques are best described not as a separate Paleolithic survival, but as something much closer to a typical Iron Age population that did not receive the same later admixture that affected much of the rest of Iberia. That is a subtle point, but it completely changes the story. Under the old myth, Basque uniqueness came from being older than everyone else. Under the newer model, Basque uniqueness comes from being less changed later. Those are not the same explanation at all. The first imagines a people sealed off since prehistory, like a human time capsule. The second imagines a population that went through the major prehistoric transformations that reshaped Iberia, but then diverged because later historical mixing affected their neighbors more strongly than it affected them. In other words, the Basques may look ancient, not because history never reached them, but because one part of later history reached them less. And once you see that, a lot of the mystery begins to reorganize itself. The genomes no longer point to an exotic outside origin for the Basques. They point to shared origins with neighboring Iberian populations, followed by a long period of relative isolation after the Iron Age. That is one reason the 2021 Basque genetic study was so important. It argued that the singularity of the Basques is better explained by demographic processes after the Iron Age, including a lack of gene flow, rather than by some radically separate origin before the rest of Iberia formed. And that is a much smarter kind of twist, because now the mystery is no longer, how did Ice Age survivors make it to the present? Now the mystery becomes what kept later history from blending them in. That question pulls the story out of fantasy and into social reality. Something had to be maintaining boundaries. Not perfect boundaries, not magical ones, but real enough for long enough to leave a detectable signature in the DNA. Geography probably mattered. Mountain valleys matter. Regional social networks matter. Marriage patterns matter. But the most intriguing possibility is that language itself helped reinforce those boundaries. The same 2021 work argues that the Basque population's relative isolation may have been linked to a language barrier beginning after the Iron Age. Notice what that means. Euskera stops being evidence for the old myth and becomes evidence for a better one. For decades, the language isolate was treated as proof that the Basques must be an untouched remnant from the deep Paleolithic past. But under the new model, Euskera matters for a different reason. It may have helped maintain a social boundary over centuries, making certain communities more likely to marry inward, communicate inward, and remain culturally continuous even while the surrounding world kept changing. That does not mean language was some perfect wall. And this is where the script has to stay honest. Researchers are not saying Euskera cast a spell over population genetics. They are saying the evidence is consistent with reduced contact and gene flow, and that language is a plausible reinforcing mechanism within that history. So the safer, stronger phrasing is not Basque DNA was preserved by an impenetrable shield. It is this: language may have helped hold a cultural boundary that, over long stretches of time, also became a genetic one. That difference matters because the truth here is more interesting than the myth. A myth gives you purity. History gives you process. And process is exactly what the Basque story now reveals. First, the region shares in the broad prehistoric transformations of Iberia, including the Bronze Age arrival of steppe ancestry. Then, after the Iron Age, the Basques and their immediate neighbors stop moving through history in exactly the same way. Their population remains comparatively more continuous, while much of the rest of Iberia receives later admixture events that make those populations drift further away genetically. The result is the Basque distinctiveness we notice today. So in a strange way, the old myth was built around a real observation and a wrong cause. Yes, the Basques are unusually distinctive. Yes, Euskera is one of the great anomalies of Europe. Yes, something about this population really did resist the blending pressures that shaped so many others. but ancient DNA suggests that resistance belongs mostly to the later story, not the deepest one. And that leaves us with the final, most human question of all. What does it actually look like when a culture holds its ground for so long that even centuries later, you can still see the outline of that choice in the DNA? So, what did that continuity actually look like? Not a people sealed behind a gate, not a population floating outside history, something quieter than that, and in some ways more powerful. The newer genetic model suggests that Basque distinctiveness was maintained not because the region escaped every outside contact, but because later gene flow into Basque-speaking areas was lower than in much of surrounding Iberia after the Iron Age. That is the key shift. The old myth said the Basque were different because they came from somewhere older and separate. The newer evidence says they were different because they remained comparatively more continuous while nearby populations kept absorbing more change. That is why cultural fortress works as a phrase only if we understand it correctly. A fortress makes people imagine perfect isolation, as if the Basques live behind an invisible wall that no one could cross. But history is rarely that clean. The better image is not a sealed chamber. It is a region where social boundaries held strongly enough for long enough to shape marriage networks and population structure over centuries. Researchers behind the 2021 Basque genetic study argue that the Basques' genetic singularity is best explained by continuity since the Iron Age, plus isolation and lack of recent gene flow, possibly reinforced by language barriers. And that brings us back to Euskera. For most of this story, Euskera looked like a clue pointing backward toward some untouched prehistoric origin. But once the old Ice Age theory falls, the language becomes more interesting, not less. Instead of serving as proof that the Basques stood outside later history, it may help explain how they remained more distinct within that history. A language isolate can do more than preserve words. It can preserve community boundaries, define who belongs, shape local identity, and quietly influence who marries whom. That is a very different kind of mystery. Because now the Basque story is no longer about one miraculous act of survival from the distant past. It is about repeated acts of continuity, generation after generation, in a region that still sat inside the wider currents of European history. Rome came. Latin spread. Later powers rose and fell across Iberia, and yet Euskera, in part of the Western Pyrenees, remained. Britannica still describes it as the only remnant of the languages spoken in southwestern Europe before Romanization. That alone tells you how unusual the endurance was. But endurance is not the same as purity. That distinction matters because the Basque story is often pulled toward absolutes. Either they were imagined as a fossil population, unchanged since the Ice Age, or modern correction swings too far and treats them as nothing special at all. The evidence supports neither extreme. The Basques are genuinely distinctive, but that distinctiveness appears to have formed through historical process, shared Iberian prehistory, Bronze Age transformation, then unusually strong continuity after the Iron Age. There is also something almost poetic in the order of that discovery. First, science saw the distinctiveness and guessed the wrong cause. Then genetics removed the old cause. And finally, the same genetics made the distinctiveness intelligible again. And that is why this is not really a story about debunking for its own sake. It is a story about replacing a dramatic but oversimplified origin myth with a subtler explanation that actually respects how populations work. People do not stay distinct only because of mountains or because they are older. They can also stay distinct because culture, language, geography, and social structure keep drawing lines long after the great prehistoric migrations have already happened, and in the Basque case, those lines seem to have held for a remarkably long time. Not perfectly, not absolutely, but enough that, even today, genetic studies can still detect that history. Enough that the Basques stand out against nearby populations. Enough that one of Europe's strangest languages survived into the modern world while so many others disappeared without leaving living descendants. That is the real cultural fortress. Not a wall around blood, a long continuity of community. And that may be why the Basque case fascinates geneticists, historians, and linguists at the same time. It sits right at the intersection of migration and memory. It shows that ancestry can shift dramatically without erasing language overnight. It shows that language can survive even after major population turnover. And it shows that when a community holds together across centuries, the result may still be visible in the DNA long after the original reason has been forgotten. So by now, the old myth is gone. The Basques were not untouched Ice Age survivors, frozen in time while the rest of Europe moved on. Ancient DNA does not allow that story anymore. But what replaces it is not smaller. It is bigger. Because now the Basques are not interesting because they escaped history. They are interesting because history hit them, changed them, and still did not erase them. And that leaves one final step. If this newer story is the stronger one, then what exactly should we carry forward from the old myth? And what completely should be left behind? So what, in the end, survives from the old Basque story? Less than people once thought. But more than nothing, what does not survive is the grand romantic version. The idea that the Basques are a pure, untouched human relic from the Ice Age, genetically frozen while the rest of Europe changed around them. Ancient DNA has broken that model too cleanly. Iberia was transformed by major prehistoric population shifts, including the Bronze Age arrival of steppe-related ancestry. And the ancestors of later Basque populations were part of that larger world, not outside it. That part is over. And it matters that it is over, because myths like that do more than simplify history. They flatten people. They turn real communities into museum pieces, as if the most interesting thing about the Basques were that they somehow escaped the normal rules of human change. But the evidence now points somewhere better. The Basques were not outside history. They were shaped by it. What does survive is the original observation that made the myth so tempting in the first place. The Basques really are unusual. Euskara really is one of Europe's great linguistic exceptions. A language isolate and the only living remnant of the languages spoken in southwestern Europe before Romanization. Basque populations really do stand out genetically relative to nearby groups. And there really does seem to have been a long period of continuity, especially after the Iron Age, in which Basque-speaking groups experienced less later admixture than much of the rest of Iberia. So the old story was not built on nothing. It was built on a real signal, then explained with the wrong cause. And that may be the most interesting part of all, because once you strip away the living fossil language, the Basque case becomes more revealing, not less. It shows how easily people mistake distinctiveness for untouched antiquity. It shows how language can survive even when ancestry shifts. And it shows how a population can become especially visible in the present, not because it remained unchanged from the deepest past, but because later history changed its neighbors more than it changed them. That is a harder story to tell than the myth, but it is also a more human one. Because real human history is almost never about purity. It is about layers, movement, replacement, survival, adaptation, memory. And in the Basque case, all of those things seem to be true at once. Their ancestors were affected by the same broad prehistoric upheavals that transformed Iberia. Their male lineages show the weight of Bronze Age change. Their language somehow endured anyway. And over the centuries that followed, a combination of geography, social structure, and linguistic separation appears to have helped maintain an unusual degree of continuity. That is not a smaller mystery than the one people started with. It is a better one. The old myth asked us to imagine a people left behind by time. The newer evidence asks us to imagine something far more plausible and, honestly, more impressive, a community that changed, endured, and held together strongly enough that the shape of that endurance can still be measured thousands of years later. So when people ask what DNA revealed about the Basques, the best answer is not that the old mystery vanished. It is that the mystery matured, The Basques are not fascinating because they are Europe's last untouched Ice Age tribe. They are fascinating because they show how badly that kind of label can misread the past, and they show, at the same time, how culture can preserve identity even in a world that never stops moving. That is the real reversal. Ancient DNA did not make the Basques ordinary. It made them legible. And once you see that, the story no longer looks like a tale of frozen ancestry. It looks like something stranger, richer, and far more faithful to history. A people transformed by prehistoric migrations, distinguished by later continuity, and still speaking one of Europe's oldest surviving voices.